You're listening to Workplace Weekly, covering workplaces and labor activism and trying to have a remotely decent time doing it. Call us Craig David calls, we are born to do it. Let's do this thing.
I like it. Welcome to episode 4 of Workplace Weekly. This is also the second part of our interview with Christina Ro-Connolly. If you didn't catch episode 3, I recommend that you go back and where we pretty much break down how cool Christina is.
Bossed up. Yeah. That resume. Yep.
Are we ready to keep on keeping on?
I think that's all we can do. We just have to roll the rest of this really fantastic interview. No special segments, as we mentioned. Just enjoy our time with Christina Ro-Connolly. Hopefully you find it as insightful and enlightening as we clearly did, because we're fangirls.
Absolutely.
Roll it. Knowing what we do as workplace investigators and knowing that what the media does as investigators and knowing in between all of that is the potential, for people to have their cases and stories heard. What are your observations about the relationship between media investigators and workplace investigators? Do you see it changing, evolving, growing further apart?
Right. and I want to touch on that in just a second, but I do want to touch briefly on kind of, because I talked about the benefits, and of course I want to sort of address the misunderstandings and the downside, the cons of having investigations sort of heard in the media.
Absolutely.
And I think really what it boils down to is information comes flying at us at an alarming rate. And it's easy to make conclusions based on the first information that's available before, as you pointed out, Kate, before an investigation can even be conducted. And let's face it, that initial information, as you so perfectly pointed out, that's not the whole picture. And by the time the investigation is complete, people have moved on to the latest clickbait. And as a result, the public really isn't fully informed of what the evidence does and doesn't support. So is that really fairness? Is that really justice when the conclusions are made on first impressions only? So that's what I'll say about kind of the downside of having investigations take place via the media. Now, to your question about the changing relationship between media and workplaces, as with anything, as the article Amy and I wrote, what it points out is, yes, there's going to be pros and cons, and as we just sort of went through that and discussed that, the pros being, yes, better education and awareness of employee rights, transparency, accountability. I think that's not going to change. I think that will continue to strengthen the relationship between media and workplaces, particularly the rights of employees. But again, we have to do that with the conscientiousness and with the savvy of knowing that conclusions based on first impressions is not justice. That is not really that's not truth. And I'm not saying truth with a capital T, but that's not the full story. And of course, the ramifications of the possible chilling effect to people who have relevant and important information, but are afraid to come forward because of what the public's blowback might be.
Couldn't agree more, and very well said. And it did just prompt one last question on the topic, which would be, you raised, it's more of a like hotshot question, but should workplace investigation reports be public if people would want access to that? Do you think that there should be some form of mandate around that? Like, what are your thoughts on that just in general?
What I've been asked to do with many of the employers that I work with, and what I think is a good compromise, is not releasing the full report with all the names of all the witnesses that I spoke to. But many, especially governmental agencies that I work with, who do have a lot more pressure than private entity clients to be more transparent, right? We have the Federal Freedom of Information Act. We have the California Public Records Act, where public entities are required to make things public. So what I've been asked to do oftentimes is to create what's called an executive summary, or just a 2-page summary of my entire report, sort of summarizing, okay, This is what the scope of my investigation was. I spoke to 7 or 8 different witnesses. I reviewed approximately 100 pages of documents, and here are my conclusions, and to sort of write a brief summary of what each of my conclusions are. And many of my public sector clients have asked me to prepare something like that, so those can be handed out during a board meeting, during a city council meeting on a particularly contentious topic. And so yeah, that's certainly one way of going about it. I don't know that there's an answer for a one size fits all, or if a mandate is really appropriate. Honestly, I haven't given a lot of thought to that, but that's one suggestion that has seemed to work in many different scenarios.
Yeah, and the reason why I ask is I think it's very interesting how information is going to be expected in the future from employees, but also just the public in general, who are made up of people who are employed. So I think that obviously we could not be going around giving out very sensitive information, what we know to be in our reports, but there has to be something. And again, it can't be one size fits all that ultimately may work, because the public interest is there. And we do want people to respect and understand the process and the conclusions. So I'm curious. I think this is one just to watch develop as the media continues on as well. So
Yeah, and
while we're
obviously
in the nitty
another.
gritty of this, oh, you go.
Yeah. And one more point I want to add, because I think it is sort of an important, you know, issue that goes hand in hand with transparency, is the privacy rights of the employees, including the privacy rights of the person who's being accused of the conduct. And I don't think anyone's come up with a really great solution to that. Like, how do we balance transparency while also honoring privacy rights? I mean, I live in America, and Americans treasure their privacy. They value their privacy almost more than anything else. So of course, people, and that's the conflict we often come up against when we're conducting investigations, is people want transparency when it comes to everyone else's information, but when it comes to their own information, they want it to be as private as possible. So that's the tension we're always dealing with, in the demands of the people who, parties, witnesses, attorneys, everybody wants most privacy for their interest, most transparency when it comes to everyone else. So as investigators, we're doing our best to try to balance that.
Yeah. I think it's an ongoing challenge and something that will demand a lot of everyone when push comes to shove, how we're actually going to balance all of those rights and all of those I don't know the right word, but expectations that develop with
Mm-hmm.
the new workforce and things like that. So now that we're in the nitty gritty a little bit of investigatory existentialism, you also developed materials around the impact of race in investigations,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which it's can be common issues that can arise during the course of an investigation, and can be related to the race or perceived race of the investigator.
Yeah. Yeah.
What prompted you ultimately to address this topic, and how does it impact investigators who are likely to investigate these types of allegations?
Whew. How much time do you have?
All the time
So,
for you, and maybe part 7 and 8 and 9
let
and
me.
10.
um, So we have our office, OIG, Oppenheimer Investigations Group, OIG. We have a very diverse office. We have a lot of diversity in the attorneys who work at our firm, and that's something that we really pride ourselves on. And something else that I really have to tip my hat to Amy Oppenheimer about is that's always been her value. Her value in hiring and in building her firm and ultimately her legacy. She's always prioritized diversity. I want to hire people who are not necessarily carbon copies of me. And that's the practice that she's built. And who knew, particularly after the Black Lives Matter movement, that having that value ended up being a very shrewd business decision as well. Complainants, people who are initiating complaints now come from all walks of life, different backgrounds, different races. And if an African American or a Black employee is bringing a claim of race about their white supervisor that's being referred to a white a human resources representative, that's being communicated up the chain to a white CEO, is that Black employee really going to be heard if they go on and hire a white investigator? And I want to be clear, that's not to say that the white investigator does not have the skills or the training to conduct an effective investigation. They absolutely do. But how does that Black employee feel? How does that, is the process going to be alienating for that person? Or is that person going to feel like they are being heard and that they are going to have a fair shake? And I think that's why a lot of employers came to our firm, because we do have such a diversity in racial makeup, in gender, in religious backgrounds, in gender identity, sexual orientation. We have plaintiffs' attorneys, we have defense attorneys, we have veterans. So I think people have come to our firm because that's something that we offer, and because of that, we've had really unique questions arise in the client relationship of wanting to hire us, not because they're interested in having their employees feel heard, but because they want us to be window dressing. For example, if I hire a Black investigator and that Black investigator does not sustain my Black employees' findings, then I want that to really mean something. I want to really send a message of, you had a total sham complaint. So we've had, and look, while no employer has come out and said that to us that explicitly, we can read between the lines and we kind of know what they're asking for. And topics about race in general are difficult to talk about. They're really difficult to talk about. You don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to offend people. But yet we have such unique experiences because of the diversity of our firm. So we started to develop these talks and these presentations about race to our investigator community, to the Association of Workplace Investigators, because we know they face similar challenges. They're investigating the same complaints. They're investigators of color, they're white investigators, and everybody is sort of challenged by these dynamics. So that's kind of where we started, is presenting these topics to our community. And it was so well received. And look, we don't get it perfect. And that's also the foot that we started off on. We're not saying we have all the answers. We're not saying that we get it perfect, but we're being faced with these really interesting questions that we want us to all work through together. And I think because that was so well received, we got these requests to do these talks for human resources professionals, and to other, to just various, to other attorney associations. And it sort of gained traction of, yes, everyone wants to talk about this, but nobody really knows how. And then people wanted more nuanced conversations. So we talked about investigating microaggressions, which I brought up earlier, which, as I said, can be an unintentional act, versus dog whistles, dog whistle politics, and how that can mean something that has sort of a subtle meaning, or a meaning that not everybody can pick up on, but it is done intentionally. And we've had those questions as well. Questions of intersectionality. When someone is complaining, this is not just because I'm Asian. This is not just because I'm female. It's because I'm both. My supervisor treats Asian men just fine. He treats, white females just fine. But the combination of me being Asian and female is what is making the difference here. He is treating me differently for that reason. So questions of intersectionality and how complex those types of allegations are to address, because you don't necessarily have good comparators for that. What if they're the only Asian female in that office? How do you compare to prove some sort of pattern of behavior? So all of these questions have come up, these nuanced, complicated, but yet juicy and interesting questions that people don't necessarily have the vocabulary for, people don't necessarily know how to think through. So that's what really motivated us to, let's talk about this, let's discuss this, because this is going to benefit all of us as investigators and the quality of our investigations, and thus it's gonna benefit the employees who bring these complaints and want to be heard.
Wow, that was very well said. I'm blown away right now.
What we've just discussed there is putting a lot of work and effort into creating an investigatory environment which is, going to be optimized for the people that are experiencing it ultimately in a very considerate, very thoughtful, and nuanced way, and pushing those conversations forward. So, one thing that I have noticed coming, because predominantly I come from a consultation background, I've only been in investigation for, about half of that time, and only with AWI for around about 2 years. What I find that we're not talking about as much, and I'd like to see a little bit more talk about, is the holistic care that goes into post investigation.
Post investigation, um, it's tricky, because post investigation, if we as investigators in our role as neutrals and fact finders are invested in the outcome, then that can potentially impact how we investigate, right? If we are interested in seeing someone terminated,
Mm.
but yet the evidence doesn't support the allegations that have been brought against them, does that somehow impact our process if we're invested in that? And so that's why I want to be a little careful about investigators playing a role in the post investigation. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not possible. So in terms of an opportunity for employees, what our firm has really made a conscious effort in doing is separating out any sort of non-neutral practice, or practices that are typically reserved for more advocacy type roles. So obviously we don't do any sort of litigation practice with our firm. Even advice and counsel can kind of be perceived as more advocacy work, right? Because you're researching and providing advice and counsel and direction to typically an employer. So our firm has made a very conscious effort to carve out any of those types of practices and to be committed to the neutral role. So one thing we've really been trying to incorporate more into our practice is conflict resolution. Of, okay, once the investigator conducts a fact finding and comes to their conclusions about what did or did not occur, can someone else in our firm who has conflict resolution training come in and provide some guidance regarding, okay, now we know that there's this conflict, now we have some more information about where it came from and what caused it. Can someone help these employees moving forward in order to build a stable and healthy working relationship versus a toxic one? So that's sort of a business model that we've been trying to work on in order to be a one-stop shop for employers, right? We can conduct the fact finding, and we also provide services to help you move forward, hopefully help you move forward past the conflict. And I think another aspect of your question, Kate, that is, sort of the post investigation opportunities for both the employer and the employees who are involved, but also kind of the holistic care for the investigator as well, right? And please correct me if I read too much into your question, but it's, I wish I had a better answer to that. It is such an important question, and it's a question that all the attorneys in my office have brought up, that many of us who investigate race-based investigations, race claims of, for me, I'm Asian American. And they want me to come in and investigate this complaint by other Asian Americans. And if I keep doing this, what does that do for my morale? What does that do to my heart in hearing how the Asian American community is being treated in workplaces? And there is also a critical role to be played about the self-care and aftercare for investigators as
Yeah.
well, right? So when you say holistic care, that thought occurs to me as well, not just holistic care for the employees who are involved, which is of course very, very important. And of course the employer has an interest in that and making sure that the workplace is healthy moving forward. But investigators have to also be mindful to take care of their heart and to take care
Mm-hmm.
of their health, because the matters that we
Mm-hmm.
investigate are so, they can be traumatizing and upsetting and emotionally taxing. So we have to make sure to have that balance as well.
I completely agree. And no, you didn't read too much into my question. You gave it more weight than it had to begin with. So the last 2 years, specifically for me, is the only time when investigation and consultation have merged. I've never been a one-stop shop. I've been an either-or style shop.
Mhm.
And I think it raises some interesting questions about the type of ecosystem that we can participate in as professionals when it
Yeah,
comes
yeah.
to, okay, well, this is the end of the road for me. Because if I could have done the last 2 years again, it definitely would have been I'm either an investigator or I'm on the mediation side. Um, and it wasn't by choice because, like, let's remember, I wasn't formally employed by anyone. I was doing all the work from that perspective. But it definitely raised that question that I think your answer speaks to a little bit of, where does the role of the investigator stop?
Mm.
What are the fair parameters, that don't undermine our credibility or integrity to do the investigation, but then also
Mhm.
how can we take those additional steps? Because I think, interestingly, when I'm thinking more about someone else's, how is someone going to be okay after this investigation?
Mhm.
I don't do investigations with autism. I will just cry the whole time. So, there are certain boundaries that we need to have.
Mhm.
At the same time, we need to be asking, who can fulfill those roles?
Yeah.
What does this ecosystem look like? And I think companies like your group that you're working with are building those types of opportunities to the extent that
Mhm.
you can. And
Yeah.
I'm very curious, based on what you're saying as well, what the future looks like and how we're able to, again, meet the expectations, because I think that there are expectations from employees to actually receive
Mhm.
something, a conclusion, but
Mhm.
then also to be followed up with.
Yeah.
And I also sense as well, what's changed the most for me in the last 3 years is people will ask, "Are you okay?"
Yeah.
as well. So it's an interesting thing because I'd never really thought about it, but I have noticed that people can see and understand when things begin to take their toll. So that's also an
Mhm.
important point. And on the note of your business, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself as a business leader and an entrepreneur? Because you're one of the busiest people I know. Did you see yourself where you are now at all? And what do you aspire to do in these roles? What's left? What stones are left to be unturned by you?
Oh my gosh. No, I did not expect to see myself where I'm at now. It's funny, the roads that life takes you down.
Oh yeah.
I don't know, Kate. Did you see yourself in the role that you're in now? I'm curious to hear that as well. Yeah, Kate's shaking her head.
No,
Yeah,
I
it's
did
it's
not.
so it's funny. I didn't see myself specifically in this role when I went to law school. I think all I knew going into it was being a second generation Korean American. My parents were immigrants, and just seeing how they were taken advantage of, overlooked, looked down upon because they weren't native speakers. And me and my sister, being native speakers because we were both born in this country, just feeling so protective of them. Um, and feeling protective of them and just feeling the injustice of how they were being treated despite all their hard work, despite them just trying to live out their American dream.
Mm,
And that's sort of what propelled me into law school, was this sense of, I want fairness and justice for and equality and inclusion for everyone. I didn't even know, those words weren't even in the zeitgeist back then, but it was this feeling I had of, I don't want anyone treating anyone else's parents the way that my parents have been treated. And so it was sort of with that vague mission of, what if you know the law, you have an advantage over everybody else. And if I know the law, I can protect my parents, I can protect my family. And I think that's sort of what led me down this path of, okay, of into the government, right? Okay, now I understand how the government works and how how to navigate this big behemoth that's the government. And through that, it's evolved into this wonderful opportunity through workplace investigations, where people from all walks of life are able to utilize the services that I can provide to hopefully have their voice be heard, even at the end of the day, not necessarily being able to sustain their allegations, because as we discussed, there's not always enough evidence to support what they're saying. But if they can walk away feeling like I handled their case with empathy, with an open ear, and that I gave them a fair shot, that to me is my life's work. That to me is my life's mission. Education and awareness about how minority communities are being treated, to give them a voice, to uplift them. That's that's how I see myself, to carry on. And like I said, that was Amy Oppenheimer's values as well, right? To hire people and to bring people into her community, into her business practice, who are different from her. Because that was the value that she had, and that to me is an important legacy to carry on, because that's my value as well. That those are deeply ingrained in my values also. And if I can be, a face, a representative of the community whose shoulders that I stand on, then I will have considered my career a resounding success.
Well, I think that's a very, very sage way to look at it. And I would also say that one of the reasons I wanted to bring you onto this show was because we have a lot of people who listen who don't work in the same spaces as us. They don't work on workplaces, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very important, I think, for people to understand that it is a very it can be a very technical job. It can be a very clinical job at times, and like you say, you can't always do or say what you as a person would do in that situation because you are a professional. But I think it's very important to show that there are professionals like yourself and groups like Oppenheimer and trailblazers like Amy who are doing this with heart, and who are doing this with people first, and really striving for that fair and equitable environment that I think we all know is possible. I think that's one of the most incredible things about, moving into an entrepreneurial space, is saying, well, it is possible. I'm sure the amount of times Amy and yourself have heard, well, that's not possible. That's not possible. Your colleague Vita, that's not possible. And yet here we are with all the possibilities realized. So I think that was something that I really wanted to highlight in bringing you on the show, is that there are people in this profession who are aiming to really deliver on those expectations that I think workers have from the people in this space.
Yes, absolutely. Well said.
Hello everyone, Kate here. We did have a little bit of trouble capturing the last couple of minutes of Tina's interview there. It doesn't matter, it was fantastic, it was awesome, and I reiterate once again how important it is for us here at Workplace Weekly to be able to bring you these experienced, knowledgeable, thoughtful, mindful voices to the table. We will be ending this episode of Workplace Weekly here. No special segments because the interview, once again, was just that good. But naturally, we will be back next week for future installments of your favorite workplace podcast, Workplace Weekly. Thank you once again to Christina for joining us, and thank you for listening. Workplace Weekly was produced by Kate Bailey and Fanny Wandell for Hand and Heart Media, the publishing arm of Hand and Heart GmbH. You can follow Hand and Heart on Instagram via @handandheart.eu, via @h_and_h media. For any inquiries related to this broadcast, please email admin@handandheart.eu. Our music was composed and performed by Amanda and produced by Amanda with Kyle Startup. You can follow Amanda on Instagram or listen to their music on Spotify, Apple, or SoundCloud. If you love Amanda's music, please consider buying it from Bandcamp. Support indie, always. Our artwork was created by Nick Renton, a fantastic photographer and graphic designer, and you can find them in the links in the episode description. You can always find Workplace Weekly on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, and Vimeo, and basically wherever you get your podcasts. For those wanting an RSS feed, the link is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening.